After World War II, Korea became a divided country, one split along the 38th parallel. The northern half became a communist state supported by the Soviet Union. The government in the southern half received aid from the United States. In 1948, the United Nations called for a national election to unify the two parts. North Korea's leader, Kim Il-sung, refused to cooperate, however. In the south, where elections were held, Syngman Rhee was elected president. Kim Il-sung remained determined to unify North and South Korea under communist rule, however, and he had a much stronger army than South Korea did. Before he could take military action, though, he needed the approval of his chief source of aid, the Soviet Union. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin approved Kim's plan in 1949, but only after Kim had guaranteed he could take over the South before the United States could intervene. On June 25, 1950, Kim unleashed 100,000 troops in a massive attack on South Korea. The North Koreans made quick gains. Just 3 days after the invasion began, they seized Seoul, the South Korean capital. U.S. President Harry Truman pledged American aid to South Korea. In an emergency meeting, the Security Council of the United Nations passed a unanimous resolution. It promised to assist South Korea in repelling the North Koreans. This marked the first time the UN authorized using armed force against an aggressor nation. Truman ordered American troops stationed in Japan to move into South Korea. He based his action on the Security Council vote, though he never asked Congress for a formal declaration of war. 20 other countries also sent troops, medical supplies, and other aid to South Korea. In September 1950, the UN decided to unify all forces fighting for South Korea under a single commander. Since the United States had sent the most troops, an American general was chosen. That man was General Douglas MacArthur. But MacArthur faced some obstacles. The American army was not as strong as it had been in World War II, and North Korean troops were an effective fighting force. At first, the North Koreans saw success. They forced the Americans and their allies to retreat to Pusan in the southeast corner of South Korea. There, the Americans and their allies held the line. The fighting continued at Pusan for nearly a month and a half, with neither side backing down. MacArthur looked for a breakthrough to end the stalemate. Boldly, MacArthur decided to launch a surprise attack at the port city of Incheon, near Seoul. MacArthur knew the enemy would never expect him to attack there. The currents and tides at Incheon made it a very difficult landing site. MacArthur's plan was to cut off North Korea's supply lines and retake Seoul. U.S. Marines landed at Incheon on September 15, 1950. The surprise attack met little resistance. From that toehold, the Americans began to drive the North Koreans back toward the 38th parallel that divided the two Koreas. 2 weeks later, MacArthur returned Seoul to South Korean President Syngman Rhee. The American success brought new challenges, though. Mao Zedong, the communist leader of China, warned the Americans and their allies not to cross into North Korea. MacArthur believed that China would not get involved in the war. He convinced Truman to let him cross the dividing line. The Allied forces advanced into the north, chasing the Communist army to an area near the Yalu River, on North Korea's border with China. But Mao felt China's safety was threatened by the advancing UN armies. He ordered his troops to attack. On November 25, 1950, 300,000 Chinese soldiers crossed the Yalu River into North Korea and attacked the Allied forces. Outnumbered 10-1, freezing and poorly equipped, the Allied soldiers were forced to retreat. The Chinese quickly drove them back below the 38th parallel again. Spurred by his troops' success, Mao decided to take the offensive and rid Korea of the non-communist government in the south. South Korean refugees fled as Mao's army crossed the 38th parallel. Soon after, Seoul fell into communist hands once again. General MacArthur wanted to bring the war into China. He even suggested using atomic bombs against the Chinese. Truman feared that using those weapons would bring the Soviet Union into the war. He turned down MacArthur's request. Meanwhile, the American troops in Korea were reinforced with more ammunition, food, and clothing. The troops were soon ready to begin pushing north again. Mao had unwisely moved his troops too far and too fast. Now he had exhausted men and unwilling, untrained reinforcements. In addition, his artillery was no match for that of the Americans. The Chinese began giving ground as the Americans and their allies advanced. Back in Washington, President Truman wanted a limited war. He hoped to force the North Koreans and Chinese into a standoff that would lead to peace talks. MacArthur urged an all-out effort aimed at total victory. He wrote a letter attacking Truman's policies. When that letter became public, the furious president removed MacArthur from command. By the spring of 1951, U.S. and UN troops had reached the 38th parallel. The fighting became a stalemate, with neither side able to dislodge the other. Peace talks began, but the sides disagreed on issues like the return of prisoners, and no agreement could be reached. The stalemate continued into the following year, a presidential election year in the United States. Dwight D. Eisenhower, who had guaranteed he would end the war, won that election. When Eisenhower took office early in 1953, the peace talks seemed likely to fail, but a new development helped break the logjam. Soon after Eisenhower took office, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin died. The men who replaced him decided that the war was too costly and had to end. They began to push North Korea and China to accept an agreement. On July 27, 1953, a ceasefire was finally signed, ending the fighting. That ceasefire is still in effect. No winner emerged from the Korean War. North and South Korea remain divided. More than 50 years after the war, American troops are still stationed in South Korea. But the United States did achieve what it had set out to do. North Korea was never able.